On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, Scottish judges rule that Boris Johnson suspending Parliament is unlawful. How will the latest Brexit drama unfold? And I speak to the son of legendary diplomat Zbigniew Brzezinski. Why have U.S.-China ties stalled since his father's generation?
If I want you to fail, we're not going to have a friendship. If I want you to succeed, it's more likely we'll have a friendship.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin our show today in the United Kingdom, where the British government has failed in its second attempt to hold a general election that they hoped would break a deadlock in Parliament. The vote came in the early hours of Tuesday before Parliament was officially suspended for 5 weeks. Before our discussion, take a look at this.
The only possible explanation.
A second government attempt to set a snap election sparked a furious debate. Opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn says he doesn't trust the Prime Minister.
We are not prepared to risk inflicting the disaster of no deal on us, our communities, our jobs, our services, or indeed our rights.
Order.
And without Labour Party support, the vote failed again.
The ayes to the right, 293, the noes to the left. 46.
With Parliament now suspended for 5 weeks, there will be no election before the Brexit deadline of October 31st. It leaves Boris Johnson trapped in a minority government.
They want the British Prime Minister to go to a vital negotiation without the power to walk away. They want to delay Brexit.
It's the final blow in a series of defeats delivered by cross-party MPs opposed to a no-deal Brexit. Earlier, on a visit to Ireland, Boris Johnson said he can deliver a new Brexit deal in time.
Of course, we must get Brexit done, because the UK must come out on October the 31st, by October the 31st, or else I fear that permanent damage will be done in the UK to trust in our democratic system.
But the warm welcome in Dublin did little to conceal fundamental differences between the two leaders. Boris Johnson wants the backstop, a measure to prevent a hard border with Ireland, removed from any new agreement with the EU. But no backstop, no deal, says Irish Taoiseach Leo Varadkar.
Morning, Home Secretary. Morning.
That view was echoed by Amber Rudd as she resigned from Boris Johnson's cabinet on Sunday. She accused the Prime Minister of putting more effort into leaving without a deal than with one. Boris Johnson still has strong backing from Brexit supporters, angry that Parliament hasn't delivered on the 2016 referendum. But solidarity shown by MPs opposed to a no deal has prevented the Prime Minister keeping control over his Brexit promises.
To enable us to get the documents which
Boris Johnson says he'd rather die in a ditch than not complete Brexit by the end of October. But that could put him on a collision course not only with MPs, but also with the law.
For more on the UK's political turmoil, let's meet the European guests first to our show. In London, we are joined by Professor Ian Begg, a research fellow at the European Institute of the London School of Economics and Political Science. In Brussels, we have Garvin Walsh, Executive Director at TRD Policy. Also in Brussels, we are joined by Stephen Blockmans, CEPS Professor of EU External Relations Law of the University of Amsterdam. Welcome to the three of you. I want to start with you, Professor Begg. How shall we describe the nature of the latest round of tango?
Well, the soap opera continues, as you can see, and what's been decided today by the Scottish Court, which is the second level of this decision in Scotland, is that the advice given by Boris Johnson to the Queen, a formal process by which she suspends Parliament, was itself, that's the advice, not lawful. Now, that follows a previous decision by a lower level of the Scottish Court which said it was lawful, and one in the High Court in London earlier this week which also said it was lawful. So where this is heading is the British Supreme Court for a final decision. if that decision is that the advice is unlawful, therefore the prorogation or suspension of Parliament is unlawful, we really don't know where we stand. It's a constitutional crisis evolving out of a political crisis. And how that is then resolved is almost in unprecedented territory for the British system.
Mr. Walsh, how should we see now the debate going on between Scotland and the British Parliament likely to or rather the legal ruling between the two sides likely to put a question about the relations between the two?
Yeah, although England and Scotland are in the same nation, they have two separate legal systems, and that was codified in their union back in 1707. So it's quite possible that prorogation could be unlawful in England, could be lawful in England but unlawful in Scotland, or even the other way around. And the Supreme Court may find itself having to try and balance the traditions of two separate systems of legal interpretation in trying to reach a judgment when it hears the appeal next week. If it goes against the Scottish court, that will provide an ideal political opportunity for the Scottish National Party, who want independence for Scotland, and to say that they have been overruled by an English court. On the other hand, if they rule that prorogation is to be upheld, there will be significant political controversy back in London.
Mr. Blockmans, given also your legal knowledge, whether it's about the EU or more about the UK itself, how should we interpret this round of legal differences in a way to reflect upon the divisions we see in different parts of the UK, England, Scotland, just to name a few?
Well, this is a matter, of course, for common law. Seen from Brussels, the EU considers this very much an internal affair of the UK and will not meddle into the constitutional wrangling that is going on at the moment. It will simply stand by the sideline and wait for a response to the question whether indeed the Johnson government is able to formulate alternatives to the much maligned Irish backstop, which Johnson wants to see removed from the withdrawal agreement that the EU negotiated with Theresa May's government.
It's getting ever more complicated. As a result of that, I need to invite in another scholar with us in the studio, Cui Hongjian, who is the Director of Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir, to our program. Listening to your British colleagues and those coming from Brussels, I'm sure you have quite some thoughts to share with us as well, looking at the situation as an observer.
I think now it's not only for, this Brexit issue only find this, the battlefield in the Parliament and also in the courts, as we find out this difference between the Scottish and also England. But now, of course, I think now people are taking more concerns about how this attitude from government, from Johnson. Because now the big question is, once there are some more limitations from Parliament in the style of laws, how could Mr. Johnson will follow this law? Because now it looks like he has been pushed in the corner. So how could he keep his promise?
It seems that you're asking the question, Professor Begg, that whether will Prime Minister Johnson still be relevant, as we talk. Furthermore, about the next step, it seems that he is losing ever more his premise in a way, as earlier he has been showing very differently.
Yes, well, we have the paradox here that the entire slogan of the Brexit side was take back control, and what Boris Johnson seems to have done is lost control completely. Where it goes next is that if the Supreme Court in London, which is a UK-wide court, not just an English court, decides that the advice to the Queen from Boris Johnson was inappropriate, it then brings the Queen into the politics of this, which Buckingham Palace has spent 70 years trying to avoid. And that's where it becomes a constitutional crisis, because we don't actually know what happens. If the ruling is that Boris Johnson's suspension of Parliament is not lawful, do you de-suspend Parliament, which is very hard because it's already happened, Or do you move into a new regime where if there's some kind of sanction on Boris Johnson and the rest of the government, under normal circumstances, somebody losing a court case of that magnitude as a prominent politician would resign. And after he resigns, we don't know what the next step would be. So it's a very confusing picture at the moment about what happens next on the assumption that this Scottish court decision holds in the Supreme Court. It may not.
Remember, gentlemen, earlier we even have a deadline, something called October the 31st, in a way. Whether election can be held before that or after that, that's going to mean a lot to the so-called dignity or political control that Mr. Johnson as the Prime Minister could have. But anyway, so let me ask you, Mr. Walsh, if things could even happen before that, is Mr. Johnson totally losing, you know, the kind of power and therefore the chance of promise that he could be able to fulfill all his earlier promises to the voters?
So Mr. Johnson is in a bit of a trap in the sense that he has a minority government. He can't get legislation through the House of Commons. He can't even get the proposal to have an election through the House of Commons. And as a result, he's got very limited room for maneuver. He can, you know, he can take to the TV studios, he can make a case to the public, but he can't actually bring the public in to participate directly.
Well, I'm not sure whether the TV studio will really solve the problem. If it could, our conversation could already lead to solutions. Mr. Walsh, you said something. I don't want to cut you short. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was that he had hoped to be able to appeal to the people over the heads of Parliament and be able to call what he called a people versus the politicians election. But Parliament realized this might be a trap, so prevented him calling the election. So he's kind of stuck there. He's forced to cohabit with Parliament, and he has to find some new strategy to try and get himself out of this particular difficulty. There are some indications he's trying to reach out to the rebels in the Conservative Party that were expelled last week, but it's not clear that those attempts to reach out are going to work. In fact, they may have actually angered the rebels even further. His problem seems to be that he has escalated significantly without having the power to carry that escalation through.
I see. Professor Begg, I'm already extremely confused as to all the political factions inside the British politics and how they could group and regroup and disband and regroup again in different ways. But it seems that that's going to be the game for now.
It is, because Britain is traditionally a two-party system. We've had, for the last 100 years, the Conservatives and the Labour Party as the two main parties, a bit like the Republicans and the Democrats in the US. What we now have is the potential for it to become a four-party system with an extreme Brexit party, led by Nigel Farage, and the resurgence of the Liberal Democrats, who were always the small third party. And this is where the British electoral system comes into play, because in every single seat in the Parliament, it's going to be a one-shot contest. If there are four parties on 25%, except that one of them gets 26, that one will win the particular seat. And you could see very strange effects. If you move from 24 to 26, your share of the seats, as opposed to your share of the vote, could multiply enormously. That's how sensitive this system is to the way it works. And what we've also seen is the series of defeats in Parliament, which means that Parliament, already before the suspension, have become dysfunctional. I think the saying is that Boris lost his first 7 votes, so instead of it being 7 up, it's 7 down.
Well, I hope, Mr. Blockman, sitting in Brussels, you're having much clearer minds than I do here in Beijing about what's going on exactly in London and elsewhere inside the UK. Any chance do you think Brussels will be able to come in and take advantage of the situation and therefore bring things more in line with what Brussels' hope would be in terms of its relations with the UK?
No, I don't think so. As stated before, it is not in the EU's interest, and it is the 27 member states of the EU to really intervene in purely domestic affairs. We're as confused as you are in
no, I feel
Beijing.
relieved.
We're watching this spectacle every night on our television, and indeed it is a soap opera, a house of cards, if you want. For the
houses
EU,
of cards, I'm afraid.
Yes, indeed. We see one at the other side of the Atlantic as well. What strikes me in all of this is that the UK obviously doesn't have a written constitution, and as Professor Begg pointed out, there's unclarity as to how this may unfold. That hammers home the point that it does help to have a written constitution to provide the subtle checks and balances. And even if a written constitution doesn't provide the answer to all constitutional questions, it may provide at least the constitutional framework in which to resolve these issues. What, on the other hand, is also striking in this whole Brexit saga is how parliamentary sovereignty of the UK is very well ingrained in its constitutional traditions and has in fact taken control over that of the government. And that is, of course, something to credit to this whole democratic system. A third point which I wanted to raise is that as far as the EU is concerned, it doesn't have to move. It can afford to look at this in an unfazed manner, in a way, as the British political system implodes almost. Prime Minister Johnson is not in a position, doesn't have the political clout at home to negotiate any type of deal with the European Union.
Right.
And whereas on the EU side, the guidelines for negotiations with the UK are very clear, all the EU 27 have to do is wait and see how this unfolds.
I see. When talking about political trends, Professor Begg, we have seen Mr. Bolton in the U.S., who has been regarded as an extremely hawkish politician, has been kicked out of the administration. Well, there are a lot of debates as to why he was kicked out, exactly whether he was kicked out or he walked out of the office, or these things continue, but it does put a question mark about the directions of politics, whether it's in Washington or in the UK, including the issue of the Brexit. Earlier we talked about the two houses of cards, and now when one house of cards has been reshuffled to a little bit extent, what does that mean if London is taking a look at itself and say, what are we doing?
Well, partly the loss of Bolton is somebody who, in his recent visits to London, has indicated that he'd be very open to a quick trade deal between the United States and the United Kingdom in the event of Brexit actually going through. But I think you can only look at what happens in the United States through the lens of Donald Trump being very petulant. He's like a 5-year-old who throws his toys out the pram when things don't go his way, and he's clearly got upset with Bolton for reasons that have very little to do with the foreign policy stance and very much to do with personality. The upshot for the UK is going to be that it's going to be that much more difficult to find support in Washington if the people that you were relying on as recently as 3 or 4 weeks ago are no longer in place.
Extremely interesting situation, I'm afraid. Mr. Cui, from your perspective, what's likely to be the next stage? Or this is only the start of the very beginning of all the dramas to come?
I think now even some media or some people now, they are trying to help Mr. Johnson to calculate what will be the next step. So I think now indeed a very narrow choice for him. Maybe a kind of the solution is a kind of the maybe I call it a suicide attack, which means that just like Professor Berg mentioned that he could resign, and also he could have no confidence issue on his own government, and then to try to break this deadlock. Maybe another choice for him is he tried to get some support from 1 or 2 member states of the European Union. But of course, it's very difficult. I think it's a very narrow possibility. But now, I think in the current, law and the political system, almost no kind of ideal choice for him.
Mr. Blockman was actually waving his head when you say he could find some allies within the EU members. Can he?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the question.
The question is, earlier the Chinese guest was suggesting that probably Mr. Johnson could find some kind of allies, even one or two, within the members of the EU country as a whole. Do you think that's possible? Briefly.
I'm rather pessimistic about that. Mr. Johnson has always been seen as one instigator, or the principal instigator for this whole Brexit mess. Now that he owns the problem, he's expected also to solve it, but don't expect a hand reaching out to him from across the channel.
I see. What about you, Mr. Washman? Mr. Walsh, sorry.
Yeah, I agree with Stephen here. It's always been, the United Kingdom has always hoped to be able to play one EU member state off against another, and has hoped to be able to negotiate its exit from the EU in the same way as it used to negotiate inside. But it turns out the rules for members inside are different from the rules for countries that are leaving. And the EU has a very well-established set of mechanisms for presenting a united front to what they call third countries. And because it's negotiating an exit deal, the UK finds itself on the outside of that wall rather than inside, helping to shape the position.
I see.
And as a result, it's made a number of mistakes in the negotiating process. It's relied too much on the large member states. It hasn't paid enough attention to the Commission. It's attempted to gang up on Ireland, whereas it now turns out that the Trade Commissioner in the new Commission is going to be the Irish Commissioner.
I see.
So that seems to have been another miscalculation.
Well, and the list goes on. Last but not least, Professor Begg, we have 45 seconds for you.
Well, I agree with Steve Blockman, that there is no way that the UK is going to succeed at this point in separating individual European countries to come to its support. Indeed, we've seen this throughout the process. Even before the referendum, David Cameron thought he could do a deal with Angela Merkel. We saw it last week when Boris Johnson was in Paris and in Berlin, when he thought he could maybe prize away Angela Merkel, maybe persuade Emmanuel Macron to be more sympathetic. And this week he went to Dublin and was told by Leo Varadkar, the Irish Prime Minister, no chance.
I see.
So it's a false way of trying to deal with it.
Ian Beck, Garvin Walsh, Stephen Blockman, and Cui Hongjian. Thank you so much, gentlemen, helping me and our audience all over the world to understand the situation much better. Thank you. I'm sure that drama will go on, as we all know. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our live program. I speak to the son of the legendary diplomat, National Security Advisor Brzezinski. Why have U.S.-China ties stalled since his father's generation? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, program coming to you live from Beijing. They say, like father, like son. That Asian wisdom at least could apply to this father and this son. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the father, and Mark Brzezinski, the son. The father was counselor to the Lyndon Johnson administration and national security advisor to President Jimmy Carter. He was instrumental in laying the foundation to the budding U.S.-China relationship. The son, Mark Brzezinski, former U.S. ambassador to Sweden, inherited his father's fascination about the world, and he is most keen on the fate of U.S.-China relations. On the sidelines of the just concluded China Development Forum held in Beijing, I spoke to Ambassador Brzezinski. Our conversation began at the Diaoyutai guest house, the very same guest house that hosted his father during those important visits to China many years ago. Take a look. Diaoyutai State Guest House. That's where your father once wore.
Yes.
I'm sure you heard a lot from him, the stories decades ago about U.S. and China.
I did.
I'm sure those stories will be even more meaningful today.
Well, it's so great that you start this interview that way. because for the last couple of days, I really felt I was channeling my late father, because he believed so much in the Sino-US relationship as having the potential to address some of the world's great challenges of today and tomorrow. He really felt that this is the most important relationship America has with the world. If he were still alive today, what he would be doing is he would be on American television using his credibility and his legitimacy as a statesman, as someone who had produced for the American people in foreign policy. He would be explaining to the American people how the Sino-US relationship benefits them, and he would be coming to China to meet with the Chinese leadership and to say it takes two to tango. Both sides have to constructively engage each other. Both sides bring good aspects and things that need to be improved.
Do we still have statesmen like this?
That's an excellent question. The American political context has changed since the time of the Cold War. During the Cold War, who led American foreign policy? Kissinger, Brzezinski, Scowcroft, Albright. People who were true foreign policy scholars and who had steeped their knowledge in foreign policy from the very beginning to the very end. They weren't part-time foreign policy guys who joined a presidential administration because they'd helped the president campaign. These were America's and the world's best experts on the foreign policy challenges America faced around the world. Since the Cold War, the primacy of expertise in American foreign policy has been replaced by other priorities in the American political game. What counts in American politics today? Is it expertise? It's more about votes and more about money. That's the American political game. And as a result, you get what you ask for. When you elect a president today, there's a lot of political people, not foreign policy specialists, but political people who want jobs in government. The foreign policy jobs are very attractive. They want the foreign policy jobs, but they don't bring the expertise.
As a result of that, how do you see the potential between China and the United States? Now, Ambassador Brzezinski, you know better than I do that what's going on right now on the trade is only a portion of the U.S.-China relations.
That's right, yeah.
The real picture is much bigger than that.
Well, let's talk about both sides, because I think that's an important point. First of all, let's not minimize the trade differences. The trade differences are important for a key constituency, a key beneficiary of this relationship, the business community in both countries and also in other countries. Don't forget about that. And all of them want this to be solved, and all of them want America and China to operate within a rules-based system. And I'm actually confident that this will be resolved, because I believe that the Chinese have been clear that they understand that there are some problems that need to be fixed, and I think that that's a very constructive way to engage. My worry is a little bit more about the American side, because I don't believe the demonization of China is just about trade. I think that there's a demographic of policy people, security people, military people, political people, who for decades have been hoping to break the catalyst of the American-Chinese relationship, and their time has come. They have been empowered by the current moment. And if President Trump left office today, they wouldn't leave. They wouldn't want to give up the ground that they fought for. And so I'm worried.
What does it take to break this almost predictable trend, as you just said, that even though the administration could go on, but some of the quote-unquote legacies of the administration and the hardliners against China and against the potential of relationship to begin with are still going to be in the system?
Sure. Well, there are also beneficiaries of the relationship. The American business community clearly benefits from a constructive, normalized Sino-US relationship. When I was the United States ambassador in Sweden, the Swedish government undertook an effort that was very interesting. They pulled together a document that was very digestible, very understandable for the American people, that analyzed state by state by state how many American jobs and in what sectors are based in that particular state on Swedish investment in, say, Virginia or Pennsylvania or New York or whatever, all 50 states. And they shared that with the business people in that state, the state governors who want to attract overseas investment, who then distributed it, and so forth and so on. That's the kind of knowledge dissemination that needs to occur about the American-Chinese relationship. And then there's the Chinese side. My father and President Xi had a very good, close personal relationship. And when my father died, President Xi wrote my mother a personally very meaningful letter that she received. And we treasure that, and we thank President Xi for that. We very much respect the fact that he's been part and a central piece of the American-Chinese relationship. It is important to accentuate in Chinese policymaking that the success of both sides is part of the relationship. Because there are some in China who see China's long-term rise. There are some in China who see America's long-term decline. And there are some who actually celebrate that. That's no way to have a constructive relationship. If I want you to fail, we're not going to have a friendship. If I want you to succeed, it's more likely we'll have a friendship.
So how do you read, given the current realities in both countries, about the eagerness to develop better relations?
Well, I think that's based on self-interest. And I think that it will become clear as that self-interest is harmed by a breakdown of the relationship, that those who are losing the benefits of the relationship will speak out.
You mean we have to hurt more in order to know the real nature of the issue?
Well, I hope it doesn't come to that.
But probably that's something we have to face.
I think that we don't want the relationship to break down. If the relationship is based on preventing failure, it's not as strong as a relationship on mutual success. But it's important for the Americans to understand that China's success is a great story for the world's humanity. And that's something that I really want to emphasize. You know, the way people in one country perceive another country is not based on a study of data and statistics and facts. For regular people, that's not how they develop their perception of, say, China or Sweden or Germany. It's based on human interest stories.
That's right.
It's based on narratives. And the narrative of China over the last 40 years, going from a country that I visited in 1981, think about that, Chengdu, for example, which only had dirt roads and used army vehicles on the streets, to the tech city of the future, that Chengdu now. That is a great rags to riches story that I think Americans would really respect and embrace, because it's, quite frankly, universal and transferable to the American narrative as well.
Indeed, a very important story to tell. China-U.S. ties are in need of patching up. We all know that. Well, Mark Brzezinski has described the importance of savvy diplomat in a time of partisan politics and policy by tweet. Where can we find such professionals? Mark hints that in addition to perseverance, sometimes foreign policy could also be a family business. Take a listen. Ambassador Brzezinski, you grew up in a family in which big matters can be discussed around the dinner table.
It's true. Very true.
I just wonder, what was it like to be in a family of the Brzezinskis?
It was the privilege of a lifetime, because we were just my brother, my sister, and I, and my sister is one of America's most popular television talk show hosts, and I think she would share this with you. When we were 7, 8, 9 years old, my father at the dinner table or lunch table would be asking us about détente, SALT II, the Middle East peace process, U.S.-China relations.
Quite an appetizer.
Yes, exactly. I'm surprised we didn't run away from home. But the point,
how did you manage to do that?
Exactly. But the point is that my father, as a Washington leader, included his family in his life. And that was a great gift because not every Washington leader includes their family in their life. So just as stupid kids, we were brought to dinners with Deng Xiaoping and Mrs. Deng.
Did you still remember anything about it? Since you were very, very young.
I absolutely remember it.
Tell me more about that.
It was very human. What do I mean by that? A dinner in your home being put on by the Premier of China. Your street is closed off by the Secret Service. There are helicopters overhead, shining lights. The Secret Service says, 2 minutes out, Deng Xiaoping, Mrs. Deng are arriving in a long motorcade with police cars. And what happens in our house? My parents light the fireplace, and the smoke comes pouring out because they hadn't opened the flue. And so you know this story. They had to shut off that room and hold the meeting with Deng Xiaoping in the front hallway. And I want to emphasize that. Because in families, not everything is perfect. And you got to just... Usually,
a lot of things are not perfect.
Exactly. And so you just deal with it.
Yeah.
So what we did was that we had that meeting there. My sister spilled caviar on Deng Xiaoping. But he included us. And he included us in things around the world. I mean, my sister traveled with my father to the Middle East and met Yasser Arafat. I traveled with my father throughout Europe and to Asia. All of us came to retrace Mao Zedong's Long March.
But you know, for the common folks these days,
yeah,
when the media is pretty much portraying things from one perspective or not, what is the way for common people, you know, to be more sophisticated about what they're seeing?
The great Czech author wrote, "For every language you know, another life you live." And I think that's true. Americans and Chinese should learn foreign languages. Because by learning foreign languages, you absorb consciously and subconsciously what's going on with them. And I go back to my late father, who spoke 5 languages, and until his dying days would translate from Russian or Polish or French from newspapers, so that he would have a feel for what is going on in Europe or in Russia. And that's important because it goes back to your initial question about foreign policy expertise. Because if you're uninformed, if you're told black is white, you'll believe it, because that's what you've been told. And foreign policy professionals need to be that, professional. And that is learned about this, and not just going on gut. And so sending out a tweet saying who is a bigger enemy, President Xi or the head of the Fed, Jay Powell, I don't consider to be professional. I think that that's destructive and insulting, and I don't like it.
Before we go, Ambassador Brzezinski, you're coming from a very well-known family.
Yes.
Your father fought his way to be where he was, absolutely through his personal fight, in a way, and efforts. What kinds of inspiration you get from your family, while at the same time, what kind of individual life you need to have of your own, apart or in addition to the family tradition?
No, my father was not born into money or power. He was cast on America's shores by World War II, so was an immigrant to America through Canada. And many people don't know this, but he had polio when he was little, and so wore leg braces when he was very young. So was he one of the chosen ones to take leadership? No, he wasn't. You said it. He had to fight for it, and he faced setbacks in his life. And there were times in my life when he shared stories that were meant to educate me. When I've had disappointments in my life, he said to me, "Mark, learn from me. Make this a disappointment, not a defeat." And he shared with me the story that when he was a professor at Harvard, the most popular professor, giving lectures that would have audiences clap for him standing, he was then denied tenure when he and my mother expected to stay in Boston as an academic family for the rest of their life. But instead they said, "I'm not going to make a defeat which brings me down and keeps me down, but a disappointment that I learn from and grow from." And he went to New York, but set his sights on Washington. And he said, "How do I use Columbia University in New York, but also relationships in Wall Street to get to Washington. And he built a relationship with David Rockefeller, and he and David Rockefeller set up the Trilateral Commission, which became the most influential organization in international affairs. And he invited then Governor Carter to join the organization, and the rest is history. He was a Polish immigrant to America, standing toe-to-toe with the Soviets. That is what I learned. And so I know exactly what you're asking. There are good points, and there are some difficult points. But the good outweighs the different because of things like that.
Mr. Ambassador, what a pleasure.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
Ambassador Mark Brzezinski telling us about his family stories and the families and the U.S. ties with China over the past decades. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and the world.